Hi, it's Professor Akers. There are a couple of things I wanted to clarify about the anti-slavery movement from the early 1800s, and I wanted to kind of bridge some of the information that you read about in Chapter 12, particularly, and augment it a little bit, and also, well, along those lines, clarify some things that have come up in the past when students and I have talked about this. So you might be wondering, why is there an umbrella on the screen? Well, I wanted you to think about the term anti-slavery as an umbrella term. So in our chapter, there are different approaches or strategies that go against slavery. So anti-slavery is really just a broad term that means opposed to the practice or the system of slavery. One thing that we want to keep in mind is that some people who are against slavery are not necessarily against it for moral reasons. And some of this will come out next week when we discuss Chapter 13 and the lead up to the Civil War. It's hard to believe that some people do not see slavery as a moral issue during this time period. There are some advocates who see it far more as slavery being a threat due to economic dynamics during this time period. So I just want to throw that out there. So anti-slavery as a umbrella term, the three main anti-slavery strategies presented in the U.S. by the 1830s were, and you probably know these, emancipation, colonization, and abolition or abolitionism. The thing about emancipation is, one thing is that the term is less about the act of emancipating somebody, and the term, when used in the early 1800s, really is tied towards the strategy of a state-level freeing of enslaved people, and it involves a law. And whether or not the word gradual appears in front of it, that is essentially what is part and parcel of emancipation as a strategy against slavery during this time period. It ostensibly ends the institution of slavery by gradually releasing some or all of the enslaved people in a given area over time. Frequently, though, such laws never actually ended up prohibiting slavery altogether because the goal was to free people who were already enslaved. For example, after a certain date prescribed in law, children born of an enslaved woman would gain their freedom. If you're female, it would be upon your 18th birthday. If you were male, it was upon your 21st birthday. That's an example of a proposed law that Rhode Island had actually at the end of the 1700s. But that gradual aspect is that people remain enslaved, and then when they reach a certain age, in that instance. Other schemes, if you want to call it that, for emancipation might be after this point in time, these people become free. But there's always a gradual aspect to it. If you think about what our textbook told us about the Talmadge Amendment in relation to part of the conflict over Missouri gaining statehood, when they first wanted to gain statehood, the Talmadge Amendment also included aspects of a gradual emancipation for those enslaved people who were already in Missouri. So gradual, state by state, that's the focus on emancipation. Colonization means ending slavery, and it involves the willing relocation of formerly enslaved people to Africa or some other location outside of the United States. The thrust that we have in our history is focused mostly on relocation to Africa because of the American Colonization Society, which you read about in Chapter 12. The American Colonization Society actually is initially founded due to the inspiration of a formerly enslaved man who had more of a missionary zeal, and through Christianity and missionary movement wanted to relocate formerly enslaved people in Africa itself. part of this trajectory of the American Colonization Society, as our textbook, I believe, mentions, is the establishment of Liberia. So if you know your geography of where that's located in Africa. But the idea of colonization, initially, we have this rubbing up against of formerly enslaved people themselves who want to relocate to Africa willingly so that they can go back to their own homeland. But as we get further into the 1800s, especially after, in 1808, the United States prohibits participation in the international slave trade, we have fewer and fewer of the enslaved people in the United States who actually have any direct link or ties or were born in Africa. So the idea of going back to Africa the further that we get into the 1800s is really not apropos. It's ascending away to Africa. And this also rubs up against a changing motivation, or maybe not change of motivation, a change in who is promoting colonization as a possible strategy to combat slavery. And that change is entering into white men of property, some of whom were slaveholders themselves or come from slaveholding families, who have come to the conclusion that it would be bad for America to have free blacks and whites living together because there is no way that that could happen harmoniously at all. And so what we're anticipating, under their thinking, if freed blacks remain, the United States will experience way too much racial conflict and potential violence. So in the minds of these men, they are advocating colonization as a way to export a racial conflict problem or something like that. So it isn't as simple as the impulse that seems better about repatriation of people who were forcibly removed from where they live, and it isn't all completely about exporting a racial problem. But because there's an intermingling of all of that and the cost that's involved of doing it, not just potentially buying people's freedom from an enslaver, but also the costs that are involved with transport across the ocean, as well as what usually became part of the American Colonization Society's efforts were to help place them with some degree of supplies and things like that in Africa itself. So I wanted to point out that colonization might seem maybe a little bit more noble, but there's a little bit of an ignoble aspect to it in terms of the way that it was carried out. So just want to say that. Okay. On to abolition and abolitionism. So I'm sure you understand that we just want an end to slavery. But one thing that it carries with abolition or abolitionism are the two dimensions of immediacy and finality. So what I've encountered over time, and I myself had encountered when I was in high school, I was learning really more intellectually about abolitionism for the first time, is that idea of immediacy. And immediate in my mind had been instantaneous. And that is not the definition of immediate for abolition. I mean, abolitionists would have loved something like that, but they were a little bit more pragmatic. And so the immediacy, I just made that disappear. The immediacy is more the definition about occurring all at once. So if we contrast that with gradual emancipation, the immediacy is, rather than saying young women once they turn 18, young men once they turn 21, and we don't even say anything about their enslaved mother who gave birth to them, maybe she has to live out the rest of her life in slavery. This strategy instead is that every single one of the enslaved people, all at the same time, gain their freedom. And the finality of it is that slavery goes away completely and that it will not ever come back again. It is perpetual in terms of the prohibition. So those were some of the things I just wanted to clarify. And thank you for your attention.